Welcome to episode 9 of Watercolor Fundamentals. Today we're going to talk about puddle consistency. So we've done a couple episodes already, episodes 1 and 2, where we talked about mixing puddles of paint. Today we're going to take that a little bit further, and we're going to talk about the consistency of the paint that we mix. So, we get the water, we put the paint in it, and the more paint we put in, the thicker the consistency. And that can have a variety of different results. So this is another way to think about this would almost be, it's kind of like wet and wet 101. I'm going to do another episode at a later date, more specific to wet and wet techniques, but this is kind of like an entry lesson into that. So I'm going to start by mixing a puddle as I normally would. Grabbing some water and putting that in here. I'm using a number 12 round. It's an Escoda Versatile. And just take about 4 little trips to the water I have off on the side there. So I've got a very watery puddle, go figure. And I'm going to do the same thing in the well next to it, except I'm only going to make a couple trips. So I have less water over here than I do there. Okay. Now I'm going to get the excess water out of my brush so that I'm not going to add more water into here. And then I'm going to start grabbing a little bit of paint. I'm going to start with some green here. This is diopside green genuine. Really lovely, kind of middle, slightly cool green. And as you can see, as I'm mixing this around, it still looks pretty watery, right? If I move my brush out to the edge there, kind of rolls down moderately quickly. I'm gonna take a little bit more paint just to make this a little bit thicker, right? We're putting, a form of solid into a liquid. And the more solid we put into it, eventually it's going to get thicker. But this is still quite thin. I'm gonna get the excess out of there, and then I'm going to clean my brush and get the excess moisture out of it. And then in this well, again, I need to make sure that I don't have any excess moisture in my brush because I would just be introducing more moisture into this smaller puddle. And I'm gonna go and grab some of this blue-violet color. Now what I wanna do with this one, so I took like 2 trips into the green, and now I'm gonna take 2 trips into this purple. Now, you might notice already the difference in behavior as I bring this puddle out towards the edges. It moves slower. This is generally how I will ascertain my puddle consistency, just by watching its movement in the well. You get used to it after you do it a number of times. And I'm going to take one more little trip here. So now it's really quite thick. It's not a paste, it's still wet. I can still load paint up into the brush, but I've got a nice thick mixture compared to this one. Okay? And the benefits of dealing with different consistencies. When you're working wet and wet, we're generally getting a lot of soft edges. If I take 2 really similarly wet puddles and then kind of paint one and then paint the other one into it, it's like dropping food coloring into a glass of water. They're just gonna mix and mingle on the paper. And perhaps that's what you want. But sometimes when we do this, we want to put a new color into it. and we still want to maintain some of the integrity of the second color that we put in. One of the better ways to do that, or one of the ways that I like to do that, I don't know if it's better or not, is to use differing consistencies. So kind of like if they talk about oil, I've heard the term painting, is it thin over thick or thick over thin? I think one of those. It's kind of like that, where I'm going to put a thin, wet consistency of paint down, and then I'm going to put a thicker one into it. And I know that the second one, the thicker paint, will still have soft edges. It's not going to be a hard edge. If we want a hard edge, we know this from hard edges, the paper needs to be absolutely dry. I'm creating a wet situation, so there's no way I'm going to get a hard edge, but I can get a little bit of control over it. So my brush is clean, and I'm going to load this brush and control some of the moisture here. And I'm just going to make a little shape with this green. Like so. I'm going to grab just a little bit more paint. There we go. Okay, so I paint this whole shape. It's quite wet right now, which is fine. And I'm just going to clean that brush, get the excess moisture out, because there's no point in, kind of working on your consistencies and then just throwing a whole bunch of wet into there. And if I go in with this purple that's quite thick, you can see it kind of stays in the area that I painted. Another thing to note is when you're going wet into wet, watch where you lift your brush, because every time I lift my brush, it's going to release some paint. So if I just want to put this in and have it slowly blend into the green, I don't want to release up here. Otherwise, that little droplet that you saw on the bottom is going to release right into the green, and you get this big blotch up here. But the way that I've done it with the thicker paint, it's not just blending straight across, it's still staying on the side that I painted it. I'm getting a nice, soft intermixing of the green and the purple. And then because I released my brush in this area, the excess paint that came out is not going to affect this edge. I see an awful lot when I'm teaching where people will go and they try to get that soft edge using a thinner and a thicker mixture, and they don't know what went wrong. And then I watch them, and they come in, and then they lift their brush, and out comes that droplet of paint, and it just goes all over the place. So one way you can avoid that is by making sure you come down and lift away from the area you're trying to have your colors mix. And as far as the consistencies of paint go, there's a couple ways that you can think of this. I've heard a wide variety of explanations, and really whatever works for you. Think of something very liquidy, like water, but you can't really think of it like water because it does have some color in it. So, maybe tea or juice, or, well, depends on the juice, I suppose. If it's fresh squeezed or fresh pressed, those can get kind of thick. But like apple juice, how about that? It's going to be very watery, right? Very slushy. You run your brush through there and you can see it move. When it comes out to the edges, it retracts really quickly. And then when you have this thicker consistency, you can think of that like cream, or maybe like that really thick pressed juice. It's going to be noticeably thicker. And as you get more used to, working with consistencies, you'll start to get a feel for it in your brush, or like I do in your palette, where you kind of watch how it retracts from your brush. Almost always, I will kind of work my brush right before I go to paint, and I bring it out to the edges and I watch how that paint behaves. That's giving me, like I said, that indication of the thickness of the paint. Another, really good thing to do too is when you're very familiar with your paints, and you kind of know what sort of values you can get out of it in varying consistencies, is just to simply, grab a little bit of your paint and just make a little swatch, right? You can just grab a little paint and just put a little line on the paper, and you kind of know, if you know your pigments well, you might know how thick that would be in order to get a value out of your paint like that. And then similarly, with the green, if you're familiar with it, you take a little bit and you make a little swatch with it, and you might know, how much paint you have in your brush to get a value like that. So a couple ways you can check the consistency, but I find personally the best way to check your consistency is watch its behavior in the palette simply by moving your brush through it and watching how it retracts. And you can just do that on a plate or on whatever type of palette you're using. Just make a small little pool and just slowly add paint. Add a little bit of paint, give it a little movement. Watch how it comes in. Add a little bit more, give a little bit of movement. Watch how it behaves, and you'll see that puddle start to get thicker and thicker. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. And this will come up again in a subsequent episode when I will focus a little bit more on wet and wet techniques. So thanks for tuning in again. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it's helpful. And yeah, paint on, my friends. Bye for now.